great pleasure I introduce to you Cosmo.
All right, so I'm gonna kill this thing and then restart it so that there's a timer that I can look at, because I'm infamous for going over time. And also, I have to warn you that I haven't rehearsed this, so this is basically going to be PowerPoint karaoke.
I love PowerPoint karaoke.
So I spend a lot of time looking at curves like this. This is the top developed nations in the world, and the relative life expectancy as a function of time. And who can guess what that red dot is? Well, which country? That's us. The United States of America, over time, has been dropping in its life expectancy compared to the rest of the developed world. And I think about that a lot. And I think about, well, what are the things that claim the most lives? And if you look at CDC data, you see that heart disease and cancer pretty much leading the list, with a couple of other diseases like Alzheimer's that kind of really take out a lot of people. And I'm dedicating my life to trying to figure out how to most reduce deaths of all causes, focusing specifically on the causes that claim the most lives. So we've known for a while that there are a couple of lifestyle factors as well that contribute to death, and these lifestyle factors are what you can consider to be bad habits in terms of dietary or exercise habits that lead into metabolic syndrome, which causes all of those diseases. Also, tobacco use, big killer. The thing about metabolic syndrome that people don't realize is that it really is a very all-encompassing disorder. It's not just responsible for making people fat. It also causes heart disease and lipid problems and even dementia like Alzheimer's disease. And yes, metabolic syndrome causes cancer, almost directly. So we know that these connections are there. And another thing I want to point out is that even if you've never suffered from being obese or struggled to lose weight, it still applies to you, because 30% of people walking around today, even though they look thin on the outside, are actually very fat on the inside, because they accumulate fat around the internal organs. And this is a state called TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. It's also, ironically enough, a candy bar name. The whole obesity thing causing the most deaths and also feeding into longevity, you can directly see this trend amongst millions of people. If you look at how heavy people are, you can directly predict how long they're going to live. And there's really like an optimal weight that you can be at. And if you're outside of that optimum region, you'll die of different causes. So obesity is a really complicated problem, and what people don't realize, it's actually a problem with the brain. So we've managed to dissect a lot of the genetic and neuronal factors behind obesity, and we found that in the hypothalamus of the brain, there's actually a very specialized circuit that detects how much you're eating, and from that modulates how much you're burning, and also regulates appetite. And it's because of this circuit. Oh, that's way. I don't know what happened there. Because of this circuit, there's this yo-yo pattern that a lot of people exhibit when they try to lose weight. They lose a little bit of weight, and then they get tired and fatigued, and they stop losing weight, and then they gain the weight back. So this equilibrium is set up because of these neurons in the brain. And if you do gene sequencing on people, you find that a lot of the genetic factors that cause elevated body mass index, these turn out to be receptors in this exact part of the brain. So we're even more confident now that this is a hypothalamic neuroendocrine disorder. Lately, however, I've kind of turned my career around, and I'm going more into brain science because I really want to know more about the brain. My experience as an obesity researcher led me to study dementia, so what I do these days is I study Alzheimer's disease, which some people are calling type 2 diabetes. We study how different parts of the brain atrophy in different disease subclasses and cause specific psychological or health effects, depending on where in the brain that atrophy is occurring. And we've developed some pretty awesome dashboards up at UCSF that basically tell you for a given patient where are the primary atrophy patterns in their brain, what parts of the brain have been affected the most, and how does that compare to a healthy cohort of people. And we also follow people over many decades, and we study their verbal or their memory scores or their language scores over time, and we can see reductions in neurological capability of some people, and we can do some very large-scale experiments. What we're finding about Alzheimer's is that there are profound connections between cholesterol metabolism and the development of the disease. And this is really clear. Many of you have probably heard for your entire lifetime that cholesterol seems to have an important part of the story of heart disease. Well, it's true for Alzheimer's as well, because elevated cholesterol in the body can cause heart disease, and too little cholesterol can cause neurological problems as well. And if you look at some of these pathways that cause heart disease, you find that the way that cholesterol is transported through the body is with these specific proteins that carry it either from the liver and to the periphery and then back again. And you can predict heart disease very well by looking at the ratio of this entire pathway. And it turns out Alzheimer's, it's starting to become apparent, is having the same kind of pattern, where the top mutant gene in Alzheimer's is ApoE. You've probably all heard about it. This is the gene in the brain that takes cholesterol and moves it into the neuron where it's needed. And we're just starting to dissect how this all works. So we're doing some genetic work up at UCSF to try to figure out what the primary mutated genes are and how they affect atrophy patterns in the brain. So I believe that if you really understand this core pathway, you can knock out all of the cholesterol complications that lead to heart disease, and also maybe address Alzheimer's disease. Aging itself has a lot of common patterns behind it, and I want to clue you in on. The human body, to work properly, needs to constantly balance breaking things down and building things back up. So there's a constant recycling process that occurs in the human body that is required for optimal health, where you have buildup of new things, buildup of new proteins in the body, and gradual tear down of proteins for recycling purposes. And it's when this thing is disrupted in either direction that you get various health problems. If you have uncontrolled growth in the human body, that can lead to cancer. And if you have lack of atrophy in the human body, of things that your cells don't need anymore, you wind up with diseases of aging like Alzheimer's, where aggregates of proteins form in the brain. We've also recently found out a lot of the genetics work in aging has been done in lower organisms like C. elegans, which are convenient to study because they die so quickly. And we can do lots of experiments on them and very quickly figure out, okay, what lets a worm live longer? So Cynthia Kenyon got famous by doing a bunch of mutations throughout the genome of the worm and found that specifically if you target the genes of the insulin receptor pathway, right, the diabetes pathway, she can make these worms live twice as long. So there's an interesting connection there. And this sort of ties with what you've all heard about calorie restriction. We've known for decades that if you let a mouse not eat as much as it wants to eat, it will live maybe twice as long. And this is really profound. And we've not necessarily repeated this in humans, but we've tried this experiment in chimpanzees, and it appears to have some merit. So there's a lot of politics about diet out there, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So one of my favorite experiments in the metabolic field dealing with longevity and health and diet is this experiment done by this guy named Panda down at UCSD, where he gave one group of mice a bunch of food throughout the day. Okay, they can eat whenever they want. Mice are awake during the night, by the way, so when the sun's up or when the moon is up, the mice can eat whatever they want. This is called the ad libitum group. And in another group, he had time-restricted mice, where he only let them eat during the night, which for a mouse is the daytime. Okay. The important thing to realize here is that both groups of mice had the exact same amount of food for their entire life. Right? It's just a restriction of when they were allowed to eat it. He also split these groups of mice into high-fat diet, the FA and the FT groups, and the low-fat diet. So can any of you predict what is going to happen to these mice? It's really quite fascinating. The low-fat diet mice stay at a fairly healthy body weight throughout their entire life. And the high-fat mouse that could eat around the clock whenever it wanted to gains weight ridiculously quickly, right? But the high-fat fed mouse that was time-restricted, it could only eat during the day for the mouse, it stayed at a healthy weight for its entire life, even though it was the same amount of calories, right? So this is very fascinating. And if they look in the liver tissue of these mice, they see that in the time-restricted mouse that was forced to starve for half of its day every day, it didn't have any accumulated fat in the liver, even though it was eating the same amount of fat as the other mouse, right? So it's not really calories that matter, it's more of a matter of how often you eat and how often you fast, right? So there's a lot of excitement these days about the low-carb diet, and there's definitely some validity there, but there's also, I think, a little bit too much fundamentalism in American culture now as to completely demonizing carbs and switching back to fats, but there's still profound evidence in the lab that high-fat diets are really bad for you. And I want to point out that original longevity plot again. You see this little dot on the top, one of the developed countries that is just exceedingly getting longer and longer lived. This is Japan. And Japan has a very high carb diet, a lot of white rice, right, and their sushi, and very low fat. So they manage to live pretty long, and they don't avoid carbs like a lot of people are doing, right? But carbs are still bad, and carbs are bad for a very specific reason that I want to make people really clear on. It's been really clear that sugar itself, as a very major carb source in American diet, is terrible for you. And it's terrible because sugar that you find in most sugar-sweetened beverages is made up of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. And it turns out fructose is incredibly harmful to your liver and causes these accumulated fats in the liver, just like a high-fat diet does. So if you want to live longer, my first advice is to avoid sugar-sweetened beverages at all costs. That is the one epidemiological finding that pretty much every metabolic biologist agrees upon. Avoid soda pop like the plague. Okay. And the reason that carbs fundamentally are bad for your health is because they give your cells a very quick and dirty source of energy. But when you do that, you don't rely on your mitochondria, which is this ancient organelle in your cell that is responsible for all fat burning in your body and also processing of wastes in the cell and a whole bunch of very fundamental biochemical reactions that make you work. And if you inhibit that mitochondria, you can develop cancer and you can develop metabolic problems. And the way that you treat your mitochondria well is you don't constantly stomp on them with a cheap source of energy like carbohydrates. So that's a very basic view of some of the really complicated biology that we do in the lab to figure out the underlying mechanisms of mitochondrial dysfunction. And then a last story that I'd like to share with you is a story about sleep, which I find particularly fascinating. People know that sleep is important, but a lot of people don't know that every single cell of your body knows precisely what time it is because there's a set of genes in your genome that measure what time of the day it is. And this is how every single body, or every single cell in your body coordinates actions throughout the day, metabolically or growth related. Of course, this is all orchestrated from the brain. Your brain knows what time it is because it can see sunlight, and it uses this to synchronize the rest of the body with hormones. And it's these synchronization signals that ultimately drive the coordinated actions of all of the organs of your body and drive the gradual growth and decay of everything in your body. I'm definitely having some animation bugs here, so I'll skip ahead a little bit. And because of these rhythmic signals of biology, you can look at any cell in the body and you can see large sets of genes that rise and fall with the day, right? And if you get out of sync, like in the case of jet lag, that causes major health complications because things in your body start doing things at the inappropriate time and they lose synchronization. So there's been a set of experiments that are done in mice these days where they damage these genes in the body or they damage the special parts of the brain that regulate sleep across the body. And these mice develop cancer and heart disease and metabolic syndrome. And these are the common causes of death, all from modifying sleeping behavior. So another advice, if you really want to live long and be healthy, is to get plenty of sleep. It's really that simple because that's some of the core repair machinery of your body and you need to treat it well. So I think I've made it very clear in my presentation that we're kind of controlled by our genetics. Genetics is this thing that we're just in the last couple of years learning how to change. But CRISPR technology, as exciting as it is, it's still out of reach for most of us, and it's going to be many years before it becomes therapeutically available. So if you want to stay healthy, you have to stick with everything on this side of the balance beam. You have to balance your lifestyle in a way that optimizes your health. So 3 years ago, I started a nonprofit to collect data based on sleeping activity and exercise and eating behavior. And that nonprofit has recruited about 1,000 people to donate their tracker data, either exercise or sleeping data, into a platform along with their genome data, and I'm doing experiments with it. So the big goal of this study is to look at people's weight fluctuations over time and correlate it to their genome, and also correlate that to their exercise habits. And to do this, I give some really stellar dashboards that give people information on how they compare to the background population, and I also give them some very complicated genetics interpretation reports, which are among the most advanced of all the genome interpretation platforms out there, and that's a very good reason. It's because I link you directly to literature, and I give a report that specifically based on your genetic mutations, the genes that are affected in your genome, and pictures of the genes and how rare they are in the general population. And most people have told me that these reports are way too complicated for them to understand. I've had a lot of people tell me, you're clearly not a businessman because you're giving people something that they cannot possibly ever understand. And the reason I'm doing that, however, is I'm not trying to run a business. I'm trying to make a very clear statement to the rest of the world that even though I have a PhD in this stuff, I really have no idea what's going on in the human body. And nobody really understands it yet. We've had the human genome around for 15 years now. We're just getting to the point where we're sequencing lots and lots of people, and this is a really exciting time to live in. And the entire project that I'm running here is basically predicated on the infinite monkeys theorem, where the idea is if you have an infinite number of monkeys in a room typing on typewriters, they'll eventually come up with Hamlet. Well, I think that if you put all this complicated scientific information out there for people to digest, even if they don't have training in this type of stuff, someone's going to find something interesting. Okay. So a lot of people would say you're calling everyone out there monkeys, and I'm like, well, yeah, we're all monkeys in this case. We've all kind of risen from the evolutionary muck, and we have no idea how any of this stuff works, how our own bodies work. We're just born into it, and it's now upon us to reverse engineer the most complicated thing that we have ever found in the universe. It's high time to start treating the human body as the computer that the open source hackers have been excited about for the last couple of years. It's finally time to start reverse engineering our own source code and eventually change it. So that's what I had to say today.
So, great point about the genome project. It's actually a fact that most geneticists only study 1.5% of the entire genome, and we ignore the rest of it. But on the topic of sugar is bad for you, it's actually the monosaccharides that are bad for you, not the disaccharides and the polysaccharides. What does your data say?
Well, we're very certain. You mentioned different subunits of sugar molecules. So when it comes to sucrose, which is the molecule I showed, it's consistent of two subunits, fructose and glucose. We know that fructose itself is an acute hepatotoxin.
Yes.
It is acutely very, very, very bad for your liver. Glucose, not so much. You can absorb large amounts of glucose throughout your body, and at that point it's more a matter of driving too much insulin that can make you sick, but not the glucose itself.
So in other words, if you drink Pepsi with real sugar, you're better off versus...
That's still sugar. If it was Pepsi with glucose, without the fructose, right? And like, for those of you who really don't like high fructose corn syrup, that's 55% fructose. But real cane sugar, sucrose, that's still 50% fructose. Right? So a lot of people don't know enough about carbohydrates to really understand the specific distinction there. That fructose is probably one of the bigger culprits that we have. Anything else?
On the issue of when you eat during the day, does that mean that Muslims with Ramadan might have an advantage over the rest of us?
No.
Yeah. I'm part of a fasting club up in San Francisco where once a week we don't eat anything for 24 hours, and we swear by it because there is so much evidence in the literature that it's good for controlling diabetes and controlling fatty liver disease and lower animals, making them live a lot longer. Thank you for the questions, guys.